You must love podcasts if you're listening to this. Do you want to start your own one or you already have one? Then follow Smarter Podcasting to get expert advice from me, Niall Mackay, the podcast guy. Since 2019, we've worked with over 40 podcasters, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts. And right now, I'm offering you a professional edit for just $27. Click the link in the show notes.
So you've got to identify who you're speaking to, because that will indicate the format, the tone, all of those things. What is the objective? Why are you doing this? And what do you want people to do with it? And podcast audiences absolutely love consistency. So if you're creating a fantastic episode every week, every 2 weeks, having that strategy and the plan will ensure that you can do it. It ensures that the processes are there. And as you mentioned before, podcasting is time intensive.
Welcome to another episode of Smarter Podcasting with me, your host, Niall Mackay. I started my first podcast in 2019 as a hobby, and I can't believe it has led to a full-time business where I was recently awarded the Audio Producer of the Year, and my first ever podcast, a Vietnam podcast, was awarded the Best Interview Podcast in all of Asia, which is incredible. Over the years since I started my first podcast as a hobby, I learned so much that I decided to start my own business, 7 Million Bikes Podcasts. And we've now worked with over 50 podcasts around the world, produced over 700 episodes, and helped many podcasts get to the top of the Apple Podcast charts, including my own as well. So now I want to share my knowledge with you through this podcast, Smarter Podcasting, where every episode we're going to share with you something to help you make the best podcast possible, whether that's talking to experts in the field, like Adam Shively, Ariel Nissenblatt, Sam Sethi, or recently Jordan Harbinger, who's been downloaded millions of times. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, make sure you go back and listen to it. But today, I'm really excited to share with you about how to plan for your podcast episode, because this guest today is going to help you make an even more successful podcast as well. So we're going to talk in this episode about planning. And my guest today, she is a podcast strategist and consultant. She specializes in helping people make impactful content that reaches the right ears. And as a strategist, she works with brands and individuals on planning and developing their ideas based not just on how you're feeling that day, but based on industry trends and insights. And she works closely here with me at 7 Million Bikes Podcast, and it's been amazing to get to work with her. She also coaches those wanting to host a podcast or to be a guest speaker, and she even runs public speaking workshops as well. So I am really excited today to be able to share with you and talk to my guest, Charlotte Lewis West. Thank you for joining me today, Charlotte.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Neil. It is lovely to be on the podcast. A little bit intimidating after all those names you just read out, but that's fine.
I hold you in the same esteem as all of those names as well.
Oh, no, don't say that.
So tell me a little bit about your podcasting background, because you're based in Singapore at the moment. But I know obviously from your accent and from working with you that you're from New Zealand, but you've worked in the UK as well. That's an amazing platform to learn about podcasting. So how did you get into podcasting and what is your background?
Okay, well, yes, the accent always does give me away, I'd have to say. So I grew up in New Zealand and I became a radio journalist as my first sort of foray into audio and storytelling. And I absolutely loved that connection with people. I was reporting on everything from natural disasters, court issues, a few nice stories in there as well. But New Zealand has a huge amount of news. And what I learned was that audio has this power to connect with people and bring news or information, especially in really tough times like the Christchurch earthquakes. And through that, I really learned that power as well of connecting with people. You know, me running around with my microphone and asking questions. People would learn to trust you and tell you what was going on and give you information. So that was the beginning of the sort of audio love and scripting and things like that. When I moved to London, I worked as a journalist for a legal publishing company. And I sort of in the afternoons, the news would get pretty slow, as you can imagine. So a few of us actually came up with the idea to create our own podcast. It would be a bit of a weekly wrap up of legal news. And someone gave us the mics and let us do that. So we did that for about 6 months. And I'd have to say there was a lot of planning and strategy, but I don't think the execution was great. I don't think anybody listened, but that was fine, you know, and that was the beginning. My next role was for an accounting firm, and to stave off some of the boredom in that role, I pitched to the stakeholders to see if we could get some budget to create a proper podcast for the accounting partners to actually talk about what they were doing and maybe show a bit more of a human side of some of these corporate figures. So I ran that for about a year. And again, it was pretty successful. And I learned all about that podcasting process. And then finally, I stepped into a role managing a podcast consultancy in London, and they specialized in branded content. And that's where I kind of found this love of bringing storytelling and audio and development with the corporate side as well. And for about 5 years, I did that. And we worked with all sorts of different brands from Unilever, GSK, the National Crime Agency. And my role was to develop the strategy for these companies to be able to actually create really interesting content that was memorable and impactful and that people would actually listen to. So that's sort of my foray into
That's
podcasting.
amazing. And one of the things I really love there, right? So you mentioned you started working doing a podcast with a legal firm and then an accountancy firm. And for many people, I think their initial reaction would be like, why would these boring companies have a podcast? Or, yeah, why would they have a podcast at all? But I think it's really testament to the power of podcasting and niche podcasting as well, because me and you are in the industry, and people who are into YouTube and content creation, they probably know this quite well. But for someone listening who's thinking, I don't really want to start a podcast, I don't really have anything to say, there is a niche for everything. And one of the big rules you hear about is talk about what you're passionate about. And whether that's accounting, we work with an accounting podcast and they get thousands and thousands of downloads, so many comments. There's so many accountants worldwide and they absolutely love that show. They tune in because they want to hear what they have to say. And I'm sure it's the same in the legal world as well. We worked with a knitting podcast that was super successful. I couldn't believe it, like arts and craft. And again, you're like, if you're passionate about something, somebody else is as well. So I think that's amazing. And it's really testament to that as well. But on the other flip side of people thinking, I don't have anything to say, I don't know what to talk about, my biggest piece of advice that I always advise to everyone is don't say that you're going to talk about everything and anything. Because this is the antithesis to what you're saying about, and we're going to talk about how you plan for a podcast. So if you're listening right now and you're thinking, well, I'm just like a really interesting person, I'm just going to talk about everything and anything, I would ask you to go to Spotify right now, go to podcasts and literally type in everything and anything, and you will find hundreds, if not thousands of other podcasts with the title anything and everything, never mind all the other hundreds of podcasts that are out there. And one thing I've learned over the years of coaching people on podcasting and learning about the industry is take everything that I say with a pinch of salt, because the advice I'm giving you is based on the knowledge that I have. But then the other day I saw this podcast was nominated for like one of the best podcasts in the UK. And I can't remember the name off the top of my head. And I wouldn't name it anyway. So I went to listen to it. And to be honest, I thought it was terrible because it was just two guys talking about everything and anything. I read the about section. There was no niche. It was just, hey, we're two guys. We're really funny. And I'm like, oh my God, this is one of the biggest podcasts in the UK. So again, caveat is don't always listen to what I have to say, but listen to what Charlotte has to say, because hopefully she'll give us a bit of insight into why that podcast is successful. Maybe they do content and planning. But my biggest piece of advice is don't do a podcast based on your personality unless you're Conan O'Brien and people already know who you are. And even then, I would not listen to a podcast by Conan O'Brien if it was just about anything and everything. And I don't, because I've never listened to his podcast. But on that topic then, with that as a background and that as a base, Charlotte, why should you plan for your podcast? What difference does it make? And how do you do it?
Oh, okay. Three big questions
We'll start
there.
with the first one.
Okay. Well, why should you plan for your podcast? From my point of view as a strategist, the strategy development is the most integral part of the podcast. It underpins everything else you do. So if you are wanting to develop a podcast and you want people to listen, you want it to be successful, you need to do some work at the beginning. And I know a lot of clients that I talk to come to me and say, I have a podcast, I've got 10 episodes, it's not successful. I don't know why. And I say, right, what did you do at the beginning? What did you develop? And they said, oh, no, I just thought, as you say, I had a few things to talk about. My boss was keen to get on the podcast. We just started talking and it's not working. And the main reason is because you haven't done any research and development at the beginning. So you sort of said, how do you plan? And this is what I work with clients on all the time. The underpinning strategy is all about thinking about your audience. So you've got to identify who are you speaking to, because that will, that will indicate the format, the tone, all of those things. What is the objective? Why are you doing this? What do you want people to do with it? Once they listen, great. Do you want them to follow you, buy something, sign up to your YouTube channel? What are you looking for them to do once they've listened? How are you going to measure success? Because that's another thing, that comes in at the end when you look at your numbers. How are you measuring the success? Everyone talks about download numbers, but it could be, that you want people to sign up to an online course. It might be that you want them to do something completely different. So the objective, the audience, your niche, what makes you stand out, and your success measurement are the four most integral parts of the podcast planning. And if you're a big brand, you're going to do a lot of work into that. And if you're an individual, you might just answer those questions and that might be enough to then move into the scripting and the production. But you need to think about those. And the other thing I always recommend that people do is look at what other people are doing. Are you doing exactly the same thing as everybody else? What are your competitors up to? What's working for them? What's not working? So this is all the work that can be done at the beginning, which then influences everything that you're going to do from there.
When you say all this, right, to me, right away, that feels really intimidating. And so I imagine a lot of people listening will be thinking, I can't do that. That's too much. But then as you were talking, I was also, because I was thinking about this podcast and the podcast that I've done. And as I mentioned, I'm not always a big planner and I don't think ahead too much. And I was like, I haven't done anything for this podcast. But then as you described it, I was like, actually, I did do all of that. I just did it in my head because I'm not big at writing things down. And so then I was thinking, where someone might be really intimidated by what you just said, you kind of talked about things like, so do you have a niche? So immediately decide what your niche is. For me, I'm helping people make podcasts. It's a bit meta, but that's what the niche of this podcast is. I said, we work with accountants, we work with knitting companies. We don't work, or not a knitting company, it was just an individual crafter. So decide your niche. I think that's really important as well. Like, what do you want out of it? And so again, you don't need to, for me, maybe write that down, but I was like, I want a certain amount of downloads. I want to talk to the best people in podcasting, and I want to help drive people back to my business, 7 Million Bikes Podcast. So if you are enjoying this, make sure you contact me. 7 Million Bikes Podcast will help you create a podcast. That's the main goal. But so I think that's just really, really important, that where it might be intimidating, even if you're an individual podcaster starting out for yourself, it is really important that you do those steps, because I think, going back to what I was talking about, thinking that you can talk about everything and anything, and podcasting does have a really low barrier to entry. I mean, you don't even need a microphone if you really want. Like, you can just record a podcast on your iPhone and then upload it. That's the minimum. Right now I have nice equipment, but I've built that up over years. So because it has that low barrier of entry, it is easy for someone to say, well, I'm just going to start a podcast and talk. And so, talking about that podcast that I mentioned that is nominated for one of the best podcasts in the UK, what makes some of those podcasts successful then? Or do you think that behind the scenes they actually are planning out content?
I think, you know what, with podcasts like that are successful, I think there's a few different factors. It could be that they're big names. So are they big name comedians that have got a huge following? In the UK, you've got a lot of media personalities. And in the pandemic, you would have seen they all flocked to podcasting because it was the only way they were going to make money. So, we suddenly had everyone from the people made in Chelsea, to everyone else, harping on about a subject on a podcast. But it might be that they're household names, or that they're comedians, or they have a following. It might be that people do actually really enjoy their opinions or non-opinions on things. It could be that they have a big social following as well, so that's sort of driving it. Fans love them on Instagram and TikTok, so they're going to listen to their podcast. But I also think that, in all honesty, it's had some form of strategy behind it. Even if the strategy is, right, you two are going to build up your kind of networks, you're going to jump on the podcast, come with energy, be funny, or be controversial. There will be someone behind that podcast planning, scripting, looking at the audience, measuring the data every week to work out what works and what doesn't, and then changing the way that they approach the content and each other each time, definitely. You don't often see, even someone like Joe Rogan has got to have some planning behind that podcast. He has the ability to kind of jump on and just be him. But like you said before, unless you are that huge comedian or that huge voice, it just doesn't work. Just jumping on and chatting shit doesn't necessarily equal podcast success.
Joe Rogan to me is something I just do not understand, because for one, I'm not his audience. Like, I've listened to it and I turned it off after 30 seconds. Like, I'm not a bro, and I'm not a right-wing bro. And most of his guests are right-wing males. I've seen studies on this. It's really obvious what he's going for. I don't understand. It's 3 hours long. I don't understand that. It doesn't really have a niche. his guests are very varied. His interview style I find really boring. He just kind of like repeats what they say and he talks really slowly and he looks stuff up online. I watched it because there was a guest that I really wanted to see who's a Vietnam-based YouTuber called Sunny from the Best of a Food Review Show. And when he was talking, it was interesting. So I don't understand. So explain that to me then. How is somebody like Joe Rogan so successful? Number one podcast. I see the charts every day. He's number one nearly every single day.
Well, I mean, it's a big question, but I completely agree with you. His podcast isn't for me. I too am not a bro. I'm not a right-wing bro. And it doesn't do anything for me. But I think in the States, which is where it's the most popular, it's the controversy he brings, it's the guests that he brings as well. You know, he's got huge guests with big followings who are also going to be controversial. He stirs up the media every time he releases a podcast. He stirred up excitement when he had the deal with Spotify exclusively, just like Call Her Dad. Yeah, Call Her Dad. He stirred up excitement when he had that exclusive deal with Spotify, like Call Her Daddy as well, did the same thing. And everyone was thinking, oh my God, exclusive deal, we've got to listen. He's got money to promote it and put
Mm,
behind it. You know, that's the other thing. A lot of people make a good podcast, but they can't work out why no one's listening. And you do often need a bit of money to promote it. And he's got a
mm.
lot. He's got a platform. He's got a captive audience already. And every now and again, when maybe he drops to number 2, he probably just puts a controversial comment out there and it goes back up again.
Really, really interesting.
And I guess on the 3-hour point, I mean, I know who has got 3 hours to listen to a podcast? Ridiculous. But the sort of length of podcasts is fascinating in terms of different geographies, isn't it? So in the States, sort of 2 hours is really popular. In Europe, I think it's about 45 minutes. APAC, it's 35 to 45 minutes. So it's about the amount of time that your audience has to actually invest in your podcast. And again, that's like a nice little data point that I use with clients all the time to help them understand. You know, you might want to talk for an hour and a half, but people in your region have got half an hour on their commute to listen. So they're going to drop off. So again, he knows his audience so well, so everything is targeted at them.
So talk to me a little bit more about that. So a company approaches you, somebody with a bit of a budget, and they say, we want to do a podcast. What then do you go through with them? Because I think that's really interesting what you're talking about by region and by commute time. So how do you plan all that out with them and what are the things that you look at?
Okay, so if someone comes to me, we start with those sort of questions. So we work through, you know, what is your objective? Who's your audience? How are you going to measure success? What's your niche? And then you move on to some of the big questions. So that helps you plan everything out in terms of understanding format. We'll then use industry trends and industry data to inform, as I said, like the length of the podcast. You'll also plan things like, you know, audio versus video. I know that's a big debate, you know, in the podcasting world. But, you know, for some brands, audio is going to be more powerful and they don't need video. And then we'll move through into the content and the sort of guests as well. You need to look at who your audience is to find the perfect host. So we're going to work through all of that. And then how much scripting do we do? But that base work is going to be at the beginning on those 4 pillars and then also competitors. And so, you know, if you're a brand, you've got a couple of competitors in mind. You're using it. I've definitely had clients who said, look, so-and-so's got a podcast. I want one. You know, there's one objective for you. But you need to look at what everyone's doing in your kind of industry, what works from their point of view, what doesn't, and use all of that information and that data as well to kind of help you build out exactly how you're going to make your podcast successful. And then you're also going to develop a promotion strategy to be able to reach those people that you're trying to. And, you know, I mentioned before about having money to promote, but for those individuals who are making a podcast who don't maybe have a lot of money and, you know, podcasting can be expensive, you don't need money to promote. But again, just understanding if you're an individual and you're wanting to make sure that people are listening to your podcast, just look at the platforms where your audience is. You know, that organic promotion is really powerful, but you've just got to make it tailored to who you're trying to reach.
No, I think that's so crucial. And it's so interesting to hear about these different planning techniques. And I think with so many things of podcasting is what you see as the final product is not what went into it with all media, right? I mean, especially just for me creating this podcast, people listening won't know that I've maybe edited a little bit here. They won't know what the length I've gone to set it up. And I think that definitely that planning stage will just never really be seen. And the more and more I've been doing this and the more that we've been working together as well, I can see how crucial that is to the success of it. I just want to touch on quickly, though, the promotion part of it, because I think that's probably one of the number one questions that people ask is, how do I promote my podcast? And that's part of what you offer as well. So somebody comes to you, they say, Charlotte, I already have a podcast. How do I promote it? What do you say?
So when people come to me and ask that, and you're right, it is a really common question. So I do take a couple of steps back and look at what their podcast is about and who they're aiming it at, not to keep coming back to the same thing, but promoting it, different podcasts in different ways is the whole power of a niche medium, isn't it? So if you've got a podcast that's aimed at people in finance versus a podcast that's for, say, knitters, you're going to promote that in completely different ways. You'd start with looking at your social media profiles, like if it's for a corporate, LinkedIn will be more powerful probably than Instagram. If it's for knitting, you'll probably be looking at something like TikTok over Instagram. So you're looking at where your audience is going to be sitting and where they're most likely to react. I'm going to look at whether or not you have budget. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. You're going to look at how you can get your podcast mentioned. Is it going to be out in, can we aim for reviews? Can we be on spaces where a lot of your audience will be talking, Reddit threads, things like that? How can we create some stir and some interest? And then one of the most powerful organic promotion tactics that a lot of people ignore is getting your guests to promote, especially if you've got guests with a good following. Get them to be putting it out there, and have the link and have everything included. Don't just have them say, yes, I was on a podcast. How do I find the podcast? Where is it? So just ensuring that you've ticked all those immediate boxes, and then you can look at, adverts, media partnerships, all of that sort of stuff. But right at the beginning, just tick the really basic stuff. Where are your audience going to be? How can they find it? Are your guests promoting? Are you promoting on your platforms? And are you driving some conversation around
I
it?
love it. I mean, I'm learning so much from this, and I'm thinking the whole time, right, I got to be starting to do more of this. One thing that I haven't done, and I read this as a really good tip, and I'm going to do this for you because I'm going to send it to you, is if you want your guests to promote it, you should write the post for them because it removes that barrier, and then just send it to them and be like, hey, thanks for coming on. If you can share this post, that would be amazing. And it just makes it so much easier for them, because it is time consuming and a little bit scary because you're like, what should I write for this? I'm not really sure. Would you advise that?
I think that's the perfect advice. You're right, because everything's in it. We're all busy people. And if someone sends me something, I could just copy and edit, copy and
Yeah.
paste. Perfect. But it also ensures you get all the brand messaging right from your point of view, that you're getting the right thing, that the link is correct. There's nothing wrong than there's nothing worse than a guest using a link that doesn't work. But it just makes it so easy. And a lot of the time you record a podcast and it may not go out for a couple of months. So by that point, the guest has probably forgotten what they were talking about. So trying to sit there writing a LinkedIn post 2 months later is difficult. So I think that's a really nice piece of advice. Send them everything, get them to copy and paste, and then
Awesome. So look out for that post. I'll send it to you, and you can share it. Now, if somebody does have a little bit of budget, that is also intimidating as well. I've found that as well. I'm like, right, so I want to spend a little bit of money promoting my podcast. How do I do that? Because I know as well, I hate to ask a question and answer it myself. But one of the things I hate, not what I hate. One of the things I've noticed is people run to Facebook. Now, would you recommend that? And what platforms do you recommend to advertise with?
I really wouldn't advise Facebook unless, again, is if your entire audience is on there, then go for it. But no, I wouldn't. And to be honest, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. In my time in podcasting, the sort of paid spend on social media is never particularly effective, because you might get a lot of impressions on the post, but the click rate on the link is actually really low. So if you've just got a little bit of budget, the most sort of effective ways, and actually the easiest ways that I would recommend people to promote, are either to do sort of adverts on Spotify or YouTube, because that's a really low cost barrier to entry. You're talking about, I think, $50 or something, and you can run your ads for a few weeks. You can really tailor it as well. So that, again, is a tailored audience kind of segment. So if you've got a finance podcast, then you're going to be aiming it at finance podcast listeners. I'm going to start that again. With these adverts, you can make sure that they're tailored to the right audience. So if you're talking about arts and crafts, you can promote your podcast on arts and crafts podcasts. Again, so you've got a captured audience, and it works really effectively across Spotify and YouTube. And then if you've got a little bit more budget, you can advertise your podcast on another podcast. And that's so powerful. You leverage their audience, you leverage the host, you leverage everything. It often isn't too expensive. I mean, If you want an advert on Diary of a CEO, that's going to burst your budget. But on a lot of podcasts, that's not too expensive. But on a lot of podcasts, that's not too expensive. But again, you're really getting your podcast out there. So I think, yeah, small advertising budget would work really well over putting paid spend behind on social media.
The other one that I've heard of the platform is Acast has been recommended quite a lot. What do you know about Acast?
Yes, Acast can be really effective. So Acast have quite a good stronghold in the APAC market. I've worked with them for years in Europe and now working with them a little bit here in Singapore. Yes, so what you would do there is rather than advertising on one individual podcast, you'll advertise on a ream of podcasts across a sort of genre. So you might advertise on 25 business. So that can be more of a wider net. So it depends on A, your budget, and B, what you're looking to achieve. But the ACAST model can work really well.
And the other one platform is Buzzsprout has now started doing their own ads. So if you have your podcast hosted on Buzzsprout, as I have all my podcasts on Buzzsprout and I've worked with them for years, you can pay, I think it's $200. I should look this up, for 10,000 impressions. And they actually tell you how many new followers they estimate you will get, which is not a huge amount. It's like 5 or 6. It's about like $50 I've read per new follower if you want to do paid advertising. Do you have any stats on that?
Oh, not on BuzzFeed, actually, I'm afraid. But no, that's really interesting. It's quite a bit of money for, as you say, one follower. And that's again where you're trying to work out, what, again, I guess, what are you looking for? Is it the impressions, the downloads, the followers? What are you looking for from your podcast and from the advertising? But I have heard that Buzzsprout can be quite useful. So I think it's just about doing a bit of research, talk to people who've maybe done it before as well, and get a bit of an understanding of what's worked for them. And then just, yeah, look at where your audience is going to be.
And the thing I heard about Facebook, which I've done a little bit of Facebook advertising in the beginning for my first podcast, and it did almost nothing. So I've got a little bit of experience with it. But what I read, which I thought was the most interesting piece, was that, like, depending on which country you're in, right? But let's say in America, I think it's 50-60% of people have listened to a podcast or listen to podcasts. So not everybody listens to podcasts. And then, so if you advertise on Facebook, 40% of those people have never listened to a podcast. So what you're asking them to do is something that they've never done before, which is behavior change, which any type of behavior change is the most difficult thing to do. If companies can change your behavior, they would all do it. So you're throwing money away by advertising on Facebook because you're advertising to non-podcast listeners. And that's partly why you should be advertising on Acast and Buzzsprout and Spotify, because you want to target people who already listen to podcasts, because it's easier for them to then be like, oh yeah, I'll listen to that podcast as well, rather than somebody who's never heard a podcast before going, oh, I'm going to start listening to podcasts now, and this will be the first one I will listen to.
Yes, that's so interesting. And you're right. Behavioral change is so difficult, and you're not probably going to be able to achieve that with your budget as well. And why would you sort of waste that? So I think that's a really, really good point. And again, another really good sort of recommendation for people that I often say is to do videograms or shorts on either TikTok, Instagram, even YouTube shorts as well. But that doesn't usually cost too much more, especially if you've already got your video content recorded. You can just cut it yourself. But they're so powerful. Videograms and video shorts on all of those social media platforms without paid spend behind are one of the most effective ways to get people really interested. A 30-second hook. And something like Diary of a CEO does it really well. They cut just before the really interesting part, and you think, oh my God, I've got to listen to that. So you can do that so easily. You can do it even at home. You don't always need someone else to do it for you. But that is, I think, a really effective way of also utilizing all of the assets that you've got to the sort of the full advantage.
Well, somebody might be watching you say this right now on a short video, because I'm going to chop this up and then we're going to post it on social media and we're going to post it on YouTube. So people might actually, that is the ultimate meta. They're going to listen to you advising to cut up your video on a short form video. And I 100% agree, because we do this as well. And it's what we advise all the clients that we work with is make a video, even if you're not going to use it. Like, I just recorded a podcast for a client here in Saigon, and we'd done audio before. And I was like, hey, do you guys want to try video? And I showed them a couple of examples, and they were like, absolutely, that is perfect. Like, they're setting up a YouTube channel as we speak right now. They've never done video before. They absolutely loved it. And again, it's for those short videos, because what I've noticed is you're going to get 100 to 1,000 more views on that short form content. And that is incredible. And what I've learned over the years as a podcaster, we want people to consume this 100% of this episode that we're recording right now. But maybe 50 people will see that. And that's amazing, right? But if I put this as a short form content and it's going to reach 500 people, and that means 500 people see 30 seconds of what you've created, that is incredible. Those 500 or 5,000, I mean, some of the shots we've created on different platforms have gone viral and got thousands of downloads or thousands of views. And when I've done it before, I put together a spreadsheet of the total impressions from YouTube to the podcast audio to every single one. Like, you can make one episode. I mean, with some of our podcasts, we'll create 5 short form contents from one episode. And then you times that by 5. So all the views on that and the podcast on the audio, and suddenly you're like, we had 10,000 impressions on this podcast. And that's talking about building your brand authority, your leadership, just like eyeballs on your brand. So I think those are really crucial. One of the questions I have before we finish is, so I believe in the short form content, but does it turn into followers and subscribers of the audio podcast?
That will depend on where your audience consume. So you might have a larger audience base that is coming through YouTube, or they might be on Spotify. So again, understanding region-wise where people listen to the most is really important. So we all know that YouTube is the fastest growing podcast platform in the world. But, at the moment, the lion's share of listening in APAC is mainly through Spotify. So you just are trying to look to see where people are, where your audience is listening. I think it will depend. It's such an individual choice. I personally really love an audio podcast because I like to listen to them when I cook or when I walk. Other people like to sit and watch or watch on the MRT, things like that. So it is a little bit individualistic depending on how you can kind of bring those listeners in and where they're going to come from. But I think videos are still one of the most crucial and impactful ways to promote your podcast. And I think if people usually listen to audio, then they're going to see that and then they'll find it through Spotify or Apple. If they usually watch, then they'll either go, now Spotify does video, or they'll go to YouTube. So people are so used to finding the content that they want to find. The podcast audience is very skillful in that. They're not going to struggle. It's more about just getting them hooked at the beginning, and then they will follow you from there if they want to listen or watch.
And I think that even if they watch your video and don't follow you on Spotify, they don't go and listen to the audio podcast, like, who cares? Like, as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of there, you're getting somebody consuming your content. And if you do a short as well on YouTube, you can look and see the percentage that it's been consumed. So you can start to see, and if it goes viral, it means that the platform has recognized that it's a good piece of content. So it starts showing it to more people. I find that it's contradictory because I love audio podcasts. I have from the beginning. It's what I started, and I've converted slowly to video. And I personally think it doesn't really move the needle so much on your audio podcast. I don't think there's a huge amount of those. If you get a viral piece of content and you get thousands of views, I don't think many of them, if any, are then going to listen to your podcast. But I don't really care because they've just consumed my content, and I'm going to do more and I'm going to do more. And it's like any marketing. I loved it. I remember years ago, I learned about Coca-Cola, right? Like, Coca-Cola is just brown, fizzy sugar water. But there's a reason why they spend millions and hundreds of millions every year, every day to promote their brand. It's so you don't forget about it and so you keep drinking it. It's not because people are like, oh my God, I love this brown sugar, fizzy, sugary, disgusting water. It's because they get marketing all the time as well. And so your podcast has to be the same as well. So don't get downhearted if you do one reel and it doesn't get thousands of downloads and suddenly you don't have hundreds of listeners. It is something that you have to do every day, all the time. And I started my first podcast in 2019. We're about to hit 100,000 downloads this year, which is still mind-blowing. And people, it's a difficult position because you read about people. We've just had Jordan Harbinger on, who's had millions of downloads, and you're like, oh my God, millions of downloads. But then at the same time, we work with clients who have just hit their first 1,000, and I'm like, oh my God, they must look at me, and they're like, oh my God, he's about to hit 100,000. So it's always difficult to compare yourself. One thing that my team and us, and we always talk about, is just try and be 1% better, just trying to get a little bit better every time. And then starting in 2019, just keep going, keep going. We've now attracted our first sponsor in years. We got 2 sponsors this week. We've just won an award for the best audio podcast. And so I guess my point is, especially with planning, if it doesn't go to plan immediately, just keep going. So what would you say the biggest difference that planning your content and strategy is going to make long-term to your podcast and the success of your podcast?
What a question. Okay. Well, first of all, by the way, congratulations on the growth of your podcast as well. That is incredible. Developing that strategy and the content plan and everything beforehand, all that planning work that we've talked about, and whether it's you do loads of work or whether, as you say, you've just got it in your mind, but thinking about it allows your podcast to be consistent. And consistency is one of the major things. So it ensures that you are following all of the messaging. You are ensuring that your podcast is achieving every time what you set out to do. You're not going to stray from the path that you've created. And podcast audiences absolutely love consistency. So if you're creating a fantastic episode every week, every 2 weeks, having that strategy and the plan will ensure that you can do it. It ensures that the processes are there. And as you mentioned before, podcasting is time intensive. So a lot of people do one series or even just do a couple of episodes and then it's too much work and they fall off. So if you're going to do that strategy and planning at the beginning, it ensures that you've got a plan through 1 season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons. You're going to follow that. You're going to keep working on it. And then at the end, you're going to keep following that. And then you'll be achieving your objectives. I've worked with clients whose biggest objective was to be able to get people to sign up to a course. They only had about, 700 listens per episode, but they got a 55% increase in signups to that course. That's huge. That was enough to get their stakeholders to sign off season 2, 3, 4, because you were achieving your objectives. And that all because you've done that planning at the beginning. So it allows you to understand your audience. It allows you to create content that your audience wants to listen to. It makes your life easier in the long run, and it ensures that your podcast consistently succeeds every episode.
Absolutely perfect. That is unbelievable advice. So, Charlotte, thank you so much for being on Smarter Podcasting. There's so much valuable information in this episode, so go back and listen to it again if you need to. If you want to work with 7 Million Bikes Podcast, then get in touch. Go to 7millionbikes.com. You can find all of our services there, including working with Charlotte for brand strategy. So if you want to work with 7 Million Bikes Podcast and Charlotte, get in touch and we'll definitely organize a brand strategy for you. And we can help with everything end-to-end podcast production, from the strategy to the recording, the production, and then all the way through to the promotion as well. If you enjoyed this episode, then don't forget, please follow, subscribe, turn on notifications, all of that good stuff so you never miss an episode. We bring them out every 2 weeks on a consistent schedule. And if you found this valuable, if you think it helped your podcast, the best thing that you could do is share this with somebody else who is creating a podcast or wants to create a podcast. And if you have any questions, then please just get in touch with me. It's neil@7millionbikes.com, or you can look me up on the website and you can get in touch with me there. So Charlotte, thank you so much. Thank you for listening or watching, whatever way that you're consuming this content, or seeing the short form content as well. And I hope you have an amazing day. Cheers.
Hi, my name is Sal Jeffries. I run the Mindset, Mood and Movement podcasts. I've been working with Neil at 7 Million Bikes for the whole of this year, literally from the start of my podcast to date. And I want to say a couple of things. So when we record the podcast, sometimes there are things that I need tweaking. There could be edits or clips. It's really simple. I give those instructions to Neil, he gets it sorted. There's sometimes a sound level differences between the guest mic and mine. Again, that's all sorted so the outcome is a really balanced sound. And also if there are issues with voice, little kind of sound interruptions, all those things that can distract a listener, Neil knows exactly what to do, cleans it up. The end result, a highly professional, beautiful sounding podcast without distraction. That's exactly what I want. I know my listeners do. So if you're interested in having that level of podcast and that kind of quality, Neil is a great guy and I highly recommend you speak to him.